seated so we can start. Good evening and Assalamu alaikum, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the last talk of the season of In Conversation series. And today we have with us none other than Komal Parvez, the one and only landscape architect in Pakistan. I'm just going to read a brief intro. So Komal is an architect and landscape architect practicing in Karachi. She did her BR from DCET, NED University, Karachi, and landscape from the Rhode Island School of Design. And masters from Edinburgh College of Arts, UK. She established the first landscape architecture firm in Pakistan. She has worked on projects all over Pakistan and internationally, in UAE and Africa, in the public and private sector. She is chairperson of CHHAAON, an NGO that she conducts tree plantation and landscape design for public spaces. Can I request Komal to be please come forward?
Thank you everybody for being here, and thank you Nishal and the IAP chapter for organizing this event. I really appreciate that you've given me an opportunity to talk about landscape architecture, a field which I am extremely passionate about. So when I was thinking about the presentation, I thought, how do I present landscape architecture? Because it's been a long journey for the profession, and so I thought that I would try and explain how it has been influenced all over the years and how it has evolved by social and political factors. So let's start with the 13th century and go to Spain, Alhambra, which is one of the best examples of seamless transition between architecture and landscape. Now, why is the Alhambra special? It's because the landscape was formulated by the architecture. It was a series of courtyards, and the rulers at that time had this magnificent approach to creating landscape which would actually dominate the architecture, despite of the fact that it was enclosed within the architecture. And it's also a wonderful example of how detailed sort of art and carving assimilates with the landscape. Now these gardens were actually made keeping in mind the Paradise Garden, but by adding a lot of botanical features in it. And it was a botanical garden in fact. So let's go to the next slide. So this was monarchy. Sorry, can we go back? Why also? So this had a degree of spirituality in it. So it was just not about aesthetics, but the spiritual side of those people affected the way landscape was designed. Although it was a monarchy where the monarch is usually a dictator, something that we are very familiar with. Next. So here we have another example of the Mughal gardens, and actually people think that it was concerned with religion, but it actually started with the Persian Charbahar, which was a concept in the holy, book of the Zoroastrians. And they had this concept of four, partitions, and the central, maybe I can just use this. Yeah, here. So, this was actually an irrigation system which divided the sort of carpet. And because this carpet was traded all over the world, you see, the concept of the Chaarbaag spread over, and especially in Persia. So this was the origin of the Chaarbaag concept. Now if you come to the Mughal era, where you had, which was established by Zahiruddin Babur, and then Shah Jahan sort of took it to another level, you see that they are using the same elements, but they have been influenced by their sense of spirituality and their techniques, and they took it a sort of degree further. Now these are pictures of the current state of the Taj Mahal and some other gardens in Kashmir, but actually originally all Mughal gardens were planted like a forest, which had fruit trees, which had deciduous trees, and which had cypress trees also, which depicted eternity. If you see the border of the Persian carpet, that was actually planted, shown to represent cypress trees which don't shed their leaves. So it sort of depicted eternity and a long life, and also the life after this world. And also the Mughal garden also incorporated a lot of irrigation techniques, but turned it into a beautifully aesthetic fountain setting. And the way the fountains sort of operated is just beyond us, that how this remarkable engineering took place. They also thought about the lighting effect in these gardens, the chini khana, and how the water went over the light. So these were just beautiful representations, but this was a monarchy. Okay, let's not forget that. So the access to the garden was only with the royal family and the royal people around it, and the rich people. They were only allowed to use these gardens. Next. Then we go to the further east, and we see the Chinese garden. We see the Chinese garden example, we see the Korean garden, and we see the Japanese garden. Now, for you and me, somebody would say, well, they all look alike, but they did not, because even their concepts were very different. The Chinese garden was deep-rooted in its, Chinese literature and, rocks, water, plants, architecture, but also spirituality, because everything, even an ornament in these gardens, represented a spiritual, aspect. Now, the Korean gardens had these special features of the abstract wooden figures and totem poles, and which refer to refer to a shamanic culture. Shamanic culture means that they believe that when the body was gone, the spirit would go into another world. So all these things were related, but it was different from the Chinese or the Japanese garden. And as you see, the example of the Japanese gardens is that they're sort of drawing from Buddhist, Shinto, and Taoist philosophies. It had a very simple, it was very simple with clean lines and a very tranquil garden. So this was the fine differences between these gardens. They were not the same. So now monarchy was also prevalent in the 18th century, in the 17th century, and we see this French example, which is absolutely different from the monarchy and the landscape design, attitude with Alhambra and with the Chinese, Japanese and Korean gardens. Now why is this? The only thing that was sort of missing in the French landscape was spirituality. There was no spiritual, no philosophical, thing related to the landscape. It was about the vision. The landscape architect, André Notre, represented the vision of a complete dictator like Louis XIV. He said that I am supreme and there is nobody, higher than me, and my power is the main thing. That's why he made a garden, which if you see the perspective, it's an endless perspective. So he was trying to portray that my power is supreme and it goes, beyond the borders. And there is no limit to my power. Now, why is this landscape so important? Now, this landscape represents the subjugation of nature. He said he was representing how to control nature. But this, plan, he was not just a landscape architect, he was an architect as well, and also an urban planner, because he made the city plan of Versailles, and this plan was so influential in very strong governments that, this design influenced urban planners in Washington and Detroit. So, actually, they were showing that when you subjugate nature, you are supreme, and there is no, supreme being, above that, because nature is the ultimate force. Okay, next. So we come to, 18th century England, and here there was a reaction from the French type of landscape. They were influenced by art. They had these beautiful paintings of landscapes, and all the lords and everybody said that we would like our very large estates to look like that art that was made by these people, by these artists. William Kent, Lancelot Brown, who was known as Capability Brown, because whenever he went to a site, he would say, yes, this site is capable of something else. And then you had, Humphrey Repton, and the last sort of great English landscape architect of the English style. So as you can see, that all these elements, they use architecture as sculpture. All these elements like the temple and the building had no use. They were just follies. They were called follies because they did not have any use, but they were just used as landmarks in the English landscape. Even now Repton, what he did was that he had this red book, and he would first paint the existing landscape, and then he would show the design to his client by a before and after picture. And you can see that the stream and the bridge were non-existent. In all these landscapes, this is all man-made. It was just a clean sort of field, and they, planted trees and streams and everything in it. So this was a landscape which was a vision which the artists made and was executed by landscape architects in England, and also a reaction to the French landscape style of subjugating nature. Next. Now we come to the United States, and in the 19th century, Olmsted is known as the father of landscape architecture, and what he did was something remarkable. He not only planned a lot of parks, but he had a commitment to the egalitarian ideals. He said that any green space should be open to the public. It should not be limited to a certain sort of class or a certain income group. So he was the first person who advocated public parks. And he did something else. His spectacular idea of the parkway. Now what is a parkway? A parkway was a road or a connection within the park which took the ecology from one point to the other. So all the migratory birds had a chance. And a stunning example is in Boston, which is called the Emerald Necklace. That is a parkway which connects a dozen parks. And also, water features, natural water features. So this was a brilliant idea. And what it did was that it brought highway engineers and landscape architects together, very different trades. Highway engineers started working with landscape architects to create scenic highways and to also create other highways, but there was always a landscape architect on board. So he really revolutionized the concept of just having a park for its aesthetic sense. And he said that the whole city could benefit. And I think that if we are able to do that in Karachi, I mean, that would be wonderful, because we have wetlands, we have hilly areas. We've got so many parks. We've got thousands of parks. According to Sherry, we have thousands of parks in Karachi. Just imagine if we create a connection through roads. Roads are generally thought of as something which bifurcates a community or an ecological system because of its chainage, because of its alignment. But he turned the tables around and he said that roads could be connectors for the ecology. So his contribution is remarkable. Next. So this was democracy and landscape, because he said that open all these green spaces to the public. Now we come to this wonderful lady, Jane Jacobs, who wrote this spectacular book, and I would suggest that everybody read that book. It's also available in PDF online. And that's called The Death and the Life of Great American Cities. So what she did, she was really only a journalist. She wasn't qualified in city planning, and she was also ridiculed for being just a housewife. So, and she was also, then what she did was that she joined Columbia and she did some courses in urban design and economics, and then she gave a lecture at Harvard which was against urban renewal. Now what was urban renewal at that time? It was the making of expressways, of making very large housing developments, of sort of demolishing old communities and making very large sort of shopping malls, etc., etc. So she was very much against it. Now there were some people who liked her idea, but most of the urban planners and the real estate developers and the government officials hated her. And they said, who's this crazy dame who's not even qualified? And but she really changed the way people view urban planning. And Kevin Lynch was one of the urban planners who actually supported her ideas, because he was about how the cities are walkable, how the community, how the people talk to each other, how you go for shopping or a coffee shop and you see a familiar face. So to them the city was about people, and they said that all these grand ideas, even Le Corbusier's idea of the garden city, was said that it's absolutely a failure because that is not what cities are made of. So if you recognize that house over there, the house which is used in Friends, which is a very popular sitcom. I'm sure a lot of people have seen that. And you saw that a group of strangers really become like family, and they come and they sit and they talk in the coffee shop. So the Greenwich Village, which she saved, which Jane Jacobs saved from destruction, represented that cities are about families. And for landscape architects, it was extremely important because the street was the public space here, and the domain of the landscape architect is the public space. That's what we live for, making public spaces better. So if you change the whole sort of nature of the city, you can't have walkable streets. You can't have those small shops where you know the shopkeeper for ages, and they know your parents, and they know your siblings, or they know your friends. So, she was only a high school graduate, but she turned the tables on urban planning. Next, so this was activism and landscape, making real changes. Now we come to this wonderful gentleman called Ian McCart. He established the School of Landscape Architecture in the University of Pennsylvania, and he did something else also. He said that landscape architecture is not limited to a plot. It is continuing, land is continuing, and his book, Design with Nature, is a wonderful book, and I would suggest that if you haven't read it, please read it, because he respected land. He said you have to read the land. For example, this, image of a piece of land represents so much. It represents the drainage system, it represents, marshes, it represents depressions. So he said that ecology has to be hand in hand with landscape architecture. You just cannot ignore it. And this also revolutionized urban design, because urban planning was not just sort of looking at a straight piece of land. You have to learn to read the land by walking through the land and really understanding what it's saying. So, and it was because of him that the geographical information systems were developed. And now you just cannot sort of do any sort of planning unless you have an idea of geographic system. And because of his input, he also, the bylaws of this building bylaws changed in a way that, suppose if I buy a piece of land and it has a stream running across, so he made because of his impact on the field of landscape architecture, you were not supposed to build on the stream, but at a certain distance. You were not supposed to pollute the land because it's not your stream. It belongs to the whole, community. So all these sort of bylaws were changed because of this gentleman, and also the stress on ecology and reading the land. Next. Now, as early as 1975, a scientist named James Hansen came up with the term global warming. Now, we tend to forget about these brilliant people who have really changed our world. Like, I always think that we people use the internet so often, but we don't know who invented the internet and changed our lives. So, this gentleman actually came up with this term, and he studied it, and he sort of presented it in the US Senate. And this whole sort of issue of climate change, came to the forefront. Now, we are not the polluters. The biggest polluters are China, United States, India, and the European Union. All the industrialized nations are the polluters, but we bear the brunt of their pollution in the form of floods, in the form of droughts, etc., etc. So, climate change and landscape has really sort of changed the value of landscape architecture. A young girl, Greta Thunberg, I'm sure you've heard of her, she is actually autistic. But look what she did. She arranged the largest, sort of climate summit, and 6 million people participated in that summit at the age of 16. And now climate change is a buzzword. In landscape architecture, you have to think about sustainability. You have to think about how, if the landscape is a burden on earth or not. And landscape architects are at the forefront of mitigating climate change. Now, every person needs to plant 8 trees a year just for breathing. The carbon dioxide that comes from our mouths when we're breathing needs to be cancelled by planting 8 trees. If you travel in a car for one mile, it generates 411 grams of carbon. If you fly 1 mile, it emits 117 kilograms of carbon. Now these statistics are mind-blowing. How we are damaging our environment and the climate, and we also bear the brunt of it. Flooding in urban housing, urban housing causes a lot of damage, and of course rural housing causes immense economic strain on the country. Next. So how has landscape changed? It has changed from those monoculture French aesthetic to biodiversity. We have to change the way we look at landscape. It's not about that cringe-worthy word which is called beautification, which every municipality likes to use, beautification. That's the worst word, I think. But do we find biodiversity beautiful? It is beautiful because it will save the earth, and I think it needs to be appreciated. Now, instead of having large maintenance lawns, we need to think about planting trees and having forested areas. This is the new aesthetic now after climate change, and we should embrace it. Next. So I like to talk just a little bit. I didn't want to, but I think you said that I have to talk about my projects as well. Now, what is a landscape architect doing in Pakistan? So when I started out as an architect, and I was very happy, but I took the leap of faith, and when I did my landscape architecture and I came back, I had no confidence, absolutely no confidence. But my friends like Khatija and Shima sort of encouraged me, and a lot of senior architects also encouraged me, and they gave me work. This is Askari Park. That was a very difficult project, Professional Development Center in Gilgit. The architects were Ijaz Ahad, but I was working through the client. So in a temperature of -2 to +40 degrees, going by road for 16 hours. Now I think how many carbon sort of miles did I emit, but it was a wonderful experience. How do you design with the Himalayas as the background? So I thought about Alhambra, and I thought about how the enclosed spaces respond. So all that thing came back, and I tried to do something, and it's been really beautifully maintained by the management. Then I did, that's my first project, the Institute of Educational Development. Again, it was a courtyard, and it was a connection of different buildings, and Alhambra was at the back of my mind. But anyway, what happens actually is that a landscape architect comes in when the architecture is done. So I have to work within those boundaries. So my first then I got a lot of residences. I used the English landscape style here because this was a huge residence made by Bilgarami Saab, and it was like 5,000 square yards. So I had the chance to do all that. My first public project was Askari Park, which I think changed my personality a little bit. Because I was working for the Engineer 5 Corps, and you can imagine the process that a person goes through when you're running a project for the army. But now I don't go through that area because it has been destroyed. In I think 2016 it was made into an amusement park. I don't even use that road now. It's so painful to see that, all those years that I spent working on it. Now, this is a time when I got this project and I started working with engineering companies. Adil Karai is not here, but I'd like to thank him. He sort of recommended me to an engineering company, and it was the first time that I went to the UAE to actually present a project in front of royalty. And it didn't help that there was a very nice looking prince whom I had to present to. But so in the end, after I made my presentation, he came up to me and he said, you know what, I'm an architect as well. So I was really happy, and we sort of exchanged some nice pleasantries, and the project was approved, and that was like a big achievement for me. Then I did another project with highway sort of engineers. So this was like a learning process which happened for me, and now I'm doing several projects in that regard. Then I also worked with a foreign contractor who was doing the US Embassy and the US Consulate. And of course, a couple of years ago, I did the front of Al Khan Hospital, and then worked for a developer as well. Next. So could you change the slide? Sorry. Yes. So currently I was really surprised that I got some factories, and I was asked to do the master plan. And now coming to think of it, if you look at the last government, it was stressing a lot on tree plantation. And I think that's how all that work came to me. And we've done Kia Motors, Pakistan Cables, and Shanghai Motors. Then we're doing some, residential towers. We designed some parks, but parks don't get built the way you design them when you design them for the government. And one should be happy if at least 40% of your design gets through, because there's so much interference. Then we'd also worked for some developers, and we have recently designed this 50-acre park made in Askari 6. So I would like to take this sort of opportunity to talk about CHHAAON. And I would like to sort of thank architect Shahid Abdullah for it. I think he was here a few moments ago, because he started a movement called Hara Bhara Karachi, so that because of the heat wave areas, Shahid Sahab, I'm talking about you right now. I was telling everybody about CHHAAON and how it came to be, and I have to thank you for it, because when you sort of inducted me in Hara Bhara Karachi, I had no idea that it was going to end up with CHHAAON. And I'm inherently very lazy. I have to be pushed into things, and thank you for that push. So after Hara Bhara was disbanded, somehow we got together, a group of friends on a WhatsApp chat group, and we started CHHAAON. And we had an inauguration at the Kayat's Mazar in 2020. Now CHHAAON has connected to students, education institutions to further the cause of being environmentally responsible. It's your individual responsibility which is important. Nobody's going to do anything for you. You have to do it yourself. And I have my beloved CHHAAON, donors here. Mishal is here, Khatija is here, Sheila, Fatma, Shima, and Saba. They're all here who have helped me in this. Also, Naheed has donated, and her neighbor has as well. Ji Salim. And he actually contacted us all the way from Qatar. So, this is how people connect, and now we're like a family. So thank you so much, CHHAAON donors. Next, I'd like to show you the first planting session at the Kais Mazar. And Nadeem, you haven't donated to CHHAAON, but we've used your song. Please.
मंजिल है आसमां है जवान जोश तेरी पहचान है जवान है तू ही पाकिस्तान जब तक है जामे जा तू जोश को रख जवान है जवान हमको है आँख उठा कर देखिए किसी इतना गम नहीं हम किसी से कम नहीं इसका हमको है क्या वतन बर्बाद है होगा हमको हम नहीं रास्ता करेगा सारा जमाना जब तक रहेगा जहाँ है जवान है जवान
So thank you so much.
अस्सलाम वालेकुम शाहिद अब्दुल्ला, आपने बहुत कुछ बातें की, बहुत कुछ सीखा हमने। चार बाग से जब आपने शुरू किया तो आई रियलाइज कि कराची में भी चार बाग बने, एज इन बाग इब्न कासिम। मेरे ख्याल में कोई चार बाग के कोई दर्जनों में वहाँ। सो विद वेरी लिटिल अंडरस्टैंडिंग उन्होंने कहा यार आसान चीज़ है कि मुगलिया गार्डन बना दो एक, तो उन्होंने बना दिया और मेरे ख्याल में कोई भी नहीं जाता वहाँ। व्हेनेवर आई हैव बीन देयर, करीब से जब आप गुजरते हैं तो आई हार्डली सी इवन वन फैमिली आउट देयर। सो आई थिंक दैट इज़ सो इम्पोर्टेंट फॉर अस टू नो कि गार्डन बनता कैसे है। और फिर आपने बिल्कुल शुरू में जो आपने मुगलिया गार्डन या मुख्तलिफ दिखाए हैं, आई डोंट थिंक दे हैड अ लैंडस्केप आर्किटेक्ट। आई थिंक इट वॉज एंटायरली द पार्ट ऑफ द आर्किटेक्चर दैट ये जो नहरें बनाई उन्होंने या जो भी कुछ किया, तो कोई आई डोंट थिंक देयर वाज अ फील्ड ऑफ स्पेशलाइजेशन हु वुड से कि ताजमहल बना दो, अब मैं इसके बाद आई एम गोइंग टू कॉल अ लैंडस्केप आर्किटेक्ट कि वो आके इसको लैंडस्केप करेंगी है। सो आई फील दैट इट्स सो इम्पोर्टेंट फॉर all the architects, whenever we are doing something, externally I think around your property, you should be doing, already worrying about the landscape around your property, चाहे वहाँ दरख्त हो या नहीं हो. I just want to give an example. When these people came to us for South City Hospital, उसके चारों तरफ कोई दरख्त नहीं था. And I recall कि ये patients बाहर क्या देखेंगे अपनी खिड़कियों से. So we ended up planting about almost 200 trees outside there. And they've, mashallah, come up so nicely. So I'm just saying that we should learn from the past, definitely. And we should be very conscious. What are we doing to our landscapes? अभी जो आपने कहा कि we should be planting a tree, I think it's an excellent idea. That we should be, and I think once a year, we should be taking a head count कि जी कितने लगाए और कितने बड़े हुए हो.
एक्चुअली आपकी बात मैं समझ गई हूँ, मगर जो मुग़ल गार्डन्स के जो मुग़ल आर्किटेक्चर के जो आर्किटेक्ट्स थे ना, वो शुरू से लैंडस्केप आर्किटेक्ट्स को वैल्यू करते थे और वो उनके साथ काम करते थे. अब ये सिचुएशन है कि आर्किटेक्ट्स जब सब कुछ बना लेते हैं तो फिर उनको ख्याल आता है कि लैंडस्केप आर्किटेक्ट्स को आप लाएं. सो द थिंग इज that was the difference when all of the trades worked, together, and they, produced remarkable examples for us to see. जी
आपने जिक्र किया कि मुख्तलिफ मुल्कों का कल्चर्स का, चाइनीज़, जापानीज़, कोरियन और फिर यहाँ का भी अल्हम्रा वगैरह का. Do we have a tradition here?
जी?
Do we have a tradition here in Pakistan, in our part of the world?
Yes.
इसलिए कि हमारे लोगों को दरख्तों के नाम तक नहीं पता. We don't know the names of flowers, trees, even birds. We don't know the names of.
Actually, that's a wonderful question. Do we have a tradition here? Because we're always talking about context. When I was studying architecture in my school, always the context was important, and I'm sure that all the people who have graduated from our school always heard this word, the context. So for landscape architecture, there was a huge, context, but it has been lost because landscape is a living sort of design. And if you look at, for example, the old houses, even if you look at Frere Hall, there was a theme, planted. If you look at the best example for Karachi's, context is the zoological gardens in Karachi. They have magnificent trees, but all those trees were not like the way we sort of go to a nursery and select a palm. Palms was not a culture of the original Karachi landscape. It became a culture in the 60s and 70s, where even the KMC emblem had a sort of a date palm, I think, on it. So this is how things change, but that's all right because we learn from the past, and a progression is necessary, but we must not forget our roots. And I feel that our context is actually the indigenous trees of Karachi. That's our context, because when suppose if you land in Dubai, you feel that you are in Dubai. When you land in Karachi, it's like there's no particular, and it's the landscape which is huge, which you recognize the city or the land with. So we have to bring back those trees again, and they're not only just for aesthetics, but also, for our environment to make it better, and also for the ecosystem. So, thank you for your question. That's very relevant. We have to understand what our context is. Yes, Sadia. Sabah.
Thank you, Komal. आपसे ये बात करके भी माशाल्लाह से बहुत नॉलेज में इजाफा होता है, और जिस तरह से आपने बताया कि आर्किटेक्ट्स जब लैंडस्केप आर्किटेक्ट को जब बिल्डिंग बन जाती है उसके बाद लाया जाता है, मगर मैं आपकी बात से इत्तेफाक करती हूँ कि ये जिस तरह से इन्होंने हमारी पुरानी इसकी कहा कि हमारी कोई ट्रेडिशन हो, तो हमारा बैंगन ट्री जो होता था वो लोगों को बैठने की और उनकी या आपस में बातचीत करने की एक जगह होती थी। तो उसमें कोई आर्किटेक्चर नहीं होता था, मगर वो एक जगह होती थी, वो एक दरख्त से कनेक्शन होता था। तो जिस तरह से आपने कोमल बताया कि हम एनवायरनमेंट के लिए और हम एक ब्यूटिफिकेशन के लिए बिल्डिंग की लैंडस्केप इस्तेमाल करते हैं, और सबसे इम्पोर्टेंटली आपने बताया कि ये हमारा प्लैनेट हमसे हमारे साथ शेयर करते हैं, ये भी लिविंग थिंग है, ये हमारे पार्टनर्स हैं और हमें उनको इसी तरीके से लेना चाहिए। सिर्फ ये इसलिए नहीं कि बिल्डिंग बन गई और उसको आपको बाहर से करना है, बल्कि बिल्डिंग के अंदर भी आपको अंदर और बाहर इस तरह से नहीं कि आप एक कंक्रीट स्ट्रक्चर में रह रहे हैं, बल्कि आपको अपने पार्टनर्स को, जो हमारे प्लैनेट के पार्टनर्स हैं, आपने जिसे बताया उसको इनकॉर्पोरेट करना चाहिए। और आर्किटेक्चर और लैंडस्केप आर्किटेक्चर जो है, मैं समझती हूँ कि ये लैंडस्केप ही है जिसमें आप आर्किटेक्चर को अंदर बिठाते हैं।
जी,
एक्चुअली इट्स लैंडस्केप,
हम यही समझते हैं।
थैंक यू कोमल, थैंक यू।
जी सादिया,
अस्सलाम वालेकुम।
वालेकुम।
I have a small question. Like you showed from the beginning of the history, there was water feature everywhere. So in your particular style, how much % of hardscape, softscape and water elements do you use?
Yeah, I think that water and landscape, like irrigation and landscape, goes hand in hand. You can't sort of detach from it. But I usually like to follow the Persian carpet tradition, and I always try to make irrigation systems within a landscape feature. They're very minimal and they are very shallow also, because we need to protect people like young children from falling into it. But I like to make like irrigation and I like to make irrigation ponds in a very aesthetic way and not just cover them up with a concrete slab. But using an irrigation system is very, very important. Using drip irrigation and using sprinklers at night so that the water doesn't evaporate. We always calculate the amount of water that is going to be used in a landscape, and we always suggest that there should be a recycling system and no drinking water should be used in landscape irrigation. Hafiz, please be kind to me.
Komal, it was a very interesting and educative lecture.
Thank you.
On landscape. Particularly, you touched the history and also touched the present scenario, which is actually both the things are very relevant to be able to, for us to be able to understand. But मैं तो आज के landscape architect को I would give a lot of credit, because I would say she or he is a crusader.
Is a crusader. Yeah.
Why? Because he has to encounter the jungle of concrete created in the modern period, which was actually not the role of architect and the classic period. Because in the classic period, the role of a landscape architect was a very complementing role, side by side, working side by side with the architect, who was actually addressing to the sensitivity of human beings. And there was the opportunity, because the world was not that economic oriented, and they were able to address to every culture was in a different way. Particularly to go to Iran, to see that the architecture produced in Iran, how well that integrated the landscape with the architecture. Go to Maidan-e-Shah Isfahan, or and all these the Persian carpet concept that you presented was very well, but that was well integrated with the space, the continuous spaces of the urban fabric was there. And actually this is reflective in the architecture of Persia as well as in the other parts of the world as well, where you mentioned about the Spanish Alhambra. There also you can see that the spaces, there is the concept of contiguous spaces, and those are spaces built to the human scale, and those things are similar. They're the two different parts of the world. One is Persia, where again they were addressing the human spaces, and if you go to Spain, there also they were addressing to the human space and the character of the human scale and the escape. But I want to make a point which perhaps you can add to your presentation, which was very comprehensive presentation, but the factor, which underlying factor, which was there and which was possible at that time, which is not possible today, is actually the advent of modern architecture and the effect on the massive urbanization in the whole world. And this massive urbanization has diminished the possibilities of countering it through the landscape architecture.
Actually,
and then it's this entire century, 2 centuries, spanning 2 centuries, and you can see in the entire world the urbanism and the carbon emission and the dependence, instead of focusing on the human being, you started focusing on the tires, I would say. So this is actually damaging the entire environment, and I would give lot of salutation and lot of credit to those people who are trying at their level to encounter those harshness created in the modern architects, by the modern architects and the modern architecture. So I would say wherever you are contributing, if there is a consciousness to bring in that level of human awareness where you are addressing to the human beings, is a great contribution, I would say.
Actually, when you talk about an urban environment and those massive, buildings, even they have found certain solution to that in the form of roof gardens. And roof garden doesn't mean a very leisurely, sort of a landscape. They plant, aquatic plants so that when it rains, it purifies, and they actually call rain gardens where it rains a lot. So what places like New York, which is very dense, and also Tokyo, if you look at those cities, sometimes trees can't even grow in New York streets because of the shadow of the buildings. So what they said, that there is a huge footprint in the form of roofs of towers, and when the rain falls, it will fall on all those plants which will purify the water, and then they will store it for their use in the building. So there's always, I think the human sort of brain is so beautiful that it always finds solutions for the problems that it has created. Which is the trade which you think is stopping our profession from progressing? And she had just one word to say. She said architects.
Like everything else, whatever you showed from the beginning, everything is very political. I mean, your terms that you also used, right? Like monarchy, so guided by what, and then democratic, if it was spiritual or whatever, and then the activists. So, and then you are referring to Jane Jacobs and Kevin Lynch in your presentation. All of that basically boils down to the fact that you look at the whole urban planning, and landscape architecture is not just trees or little gardens.
No.
It's that overall sprawl and how it will interact with the buildings which are going to be part of that intervention, the streets, the avenues, whatever. So in looking at that, in modern day, I know Hafiz Habibi spoke about modern movement and all, but I would talk about Pakistan and the cities. How can these, the government actually create that vision to be able to have those kind of guidelines for urban planning, and I think even for rural, because it's also very important in rural that when, you know, a lot of stuff is non-engineered buildings and all by the community who understands that context, but as soon as architects go and they do all kinds of things there, then the whole nature gets. So what would be your take, since you're so much into working with governments as well, that how can that be improved over here?
Actually, you know that I am an architect, and when I went into landscape architecture, I really didn't know the extent of this field. Actually, landscape architecture is the only profession which brings architecture and urban planners, highway engineers, everybody together. I think that coordination between all trades is extremely important, and please give value to professionals. This is my plea to you, because we don't seem to value very, very important trades. And that's the only way. And also numbers. We need lots of landscape architects here. We need young landscape architects. We need people to go and study landscape architecture. Because when I went to study, I had no idea. I thought it was just like a glorified garden, and I was just taken aback. I mean, the things that hit me just, you know, turned everything around for me. And I hope that this talk has also enlightened a lot of my very nice friends and professionals here to understand how important it is for us to be involved in public projects. Yes, it's a big headache. It gives a lot of pain. But if we want to change our city, if we want to change our country, we have to be involved in public projects. We just cannot design for dictators and monarchs, small monarchs. We have to go out into the public domain. And we will make mistakes, but we will at least say that we tried.
Want to, before we had a lot of fruit trees in people's houses. Up with the urbanization getting so rampant, you don't have much space to grow. Do you think of urban landscape as being edible? You know,
Yes.
and fruit trees as such, बहुत कम उनकी value हो गई है with time. Is there anything that you could do to revive that war? Because every house used to have 3 or 4 types of fruit trees in their houses. Today you don't see that anymore, and especially when you have a designed landscape, there are even less edible features in there.
That's because landscapes are now designed by, you know, nursery walas and, you know, some rishtedars who think that they know landscape. But I mean, I can speak for myself only that, but your sort of, you know, observation about not having fruit trees is because people have got smaller houses now. But I still think that a roof is a very, very important, you know, factor where you can grow your own vegetables, you can really grow fresh vegetables, and community gardens. I think community gardens which have fruits in it. As a matter of fact, I recently designed a park for the Sindh government, but they've just planted grass in it, and I had a community garden there. Maybe they'll change it, I don't know. But they had, I designed a community fruit garden. It's just near, you know, grammar school, but they have just planted it with grass right now. So you see, you have to keep trying. Don't be disappointed. You have to keep trying to do these things. And what I usually do is that when I do a landscape, I first try and educate my client about indigenous plants and how helpful they will be to your health, to the environment. And the selling point is that they will take less water. They said, yes, theek hai. Tariq, would you like to contribute something? Because you've been a very, you know, proficient activist, and I'd like you to be a part of this conversation.
You said everything that probably needs to be said, but I wanted to ask you, I know you're not a botanist, you told me that clearly, but what are the indigenous plants of Karachi?
Oh, there's a whole list. You see, they are two types of plants. One are the indigenous. You can use both. Because when there's an urban development, there's lots of interaction with the outside world. And you know, Karachi in the 1920s was a very robust port because of the World War. And it saw a lot of, money flowing into the city. And so, a lot of plants came. When the British came, they established the zoo as actually a food factory for their soldiers. And they planted all sorts of fruit trees and vegetables there. So when you talk about indigenous trees, there is a category. One is that which have been here for 200 years or so, and one which have been acclimatized, like, Well, for example, like the neem tree is an acclimatized tree. It's not an indigenous tree, but the bacane tree is an indigenous tree. So there's a whole list, and if you want to sort of find out about that, that's a horticulturist speciality. I like to stress that landscape architects are not horticulturists, like architects are not civil engineers. So horticulture is a beautiful field which we take help of, and of course have some knowledge, like architects have some knowledge of civil engineering.
अस्सलाम वालेकुम मैम, जैसे पहले हम मैनुअल ड्राफ्टिंग करते थे, फिर ऑटोकैड आया, फिर बिम मॉडलिंग, रैविट और इस तरह के सॉफ्टवेयर आए, तो अब एआई बहुत ट्रेंड में चल रहा है. तो एआई को हम कुछ भी प्रॉम्प्ट डालते हैं कि हमें ये चाहिए, ये रिक्वायरमेंट है हमारी, तो वो पूरी हमें उसकी प्रॉपर डॉक्यूमेंटेशन, डिज़ाइन, हर चीज़ बना के दे रहा है. अभी मैंने भी 1-2 प्लेटफॉर्म्स ट्राई किए हैं, तो उसमें मैंने प्रॉम्प्ट डाला कि मुझे ये लैंडस्केप चाहिए इस टाइप का, तो उन्होंने पूरा जनरेट करके दिया. एक ट्री का नाम बताया, कार्बन एमिशंस, हर चीज़. मिड जर्नी है, मेक इट एआई है, कुहुम है, और डिफरेंट एआई सॉफ्टवेयर्स और प्लेटफॉर्म्स अवेलेबल हैं. तो हमारा फ्यूचर इसमें आपको क्या नज़र आता है? एग्जीक्यूशन तो हम देख लेते हैं, ओके, वेंडर्स को डील करना, ये सारी चीज़ें, लेकिन जो एआई का एक बूम आया हमारी फील्ड के अंदर, चाहे वो डिज़ाइनिंग हो, इवन के डॉक्यूमेंटेशन, वर्किंग ड्राइंग्स, कुछ भी आपको चाहिए हो, तो सारे प्लेटफॉर्म्स अब अवेलेबल हैं हमारे पास. रेंडरिंग करनी हो, कुछ भी हो, तो इस पे आपके क्या कमेंट्स हैं? थैंक यू.
It's going to be very dangerous to control it, because we don't know how it's going to. We don't even know if that is a real person. You don't even know if I'm a hologram right now. In the future, I'll be a hologram, and you won't see me in person. But there's one thing I know, that AI doesn't have a heart. AI doesn't have spirituality. AI को गुस्सा नहीं आता. AI को मोहब्बत नहीं होती. तो ये जो फैक्टर्स हैं, AI को खूबसूरती नहीं समझ आती कि ये खूबसूरत है, ये क्या है. So AI is something without a heart, and that is something you have. Your brain and your heart, together form spectacular things. AI will only be copying what has been fed into them. So they are intelligent in that way, and yes, it can destroy certain occupations. It can wipe out a lot of architectural, jobs. It can wipe out even teachers, because right now people are using AI to write their thesis or their reports, and there is no way to confirm if it's देखो आप हंस रहे हो ना, किया है कुछ आपने. And it's very dangerous, but I truly feel that nothing can compare to a human.
Thank you, everybody, and thank you, Architect Komal Parvez. Can I request everybody to join us on the stage?
Thank you.